Hi, so good morning, everyone, and many thanks to InterArts and Women Against Rape for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. So my presentation will focus specifically on outlining recommendations for reducing stigma and discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community in Antigua and Barbuda. And the recommendations are, of course, informed by the findings of the research that was already outlined by Dr. Esprit, as well as feedback from different stakeholders in Antigua and Barbuda. And even though Dr. Esprit would have touched on some of those recommendations, my presentation will go into a little bit more detail, and the recommendations that are outlined in this presentation are also contained in more detail in a policy brief that was developed in collaboration with InterArts as well as Women Against Rape. So to start.
Ms. Gray, Ms. Gray, one moment, please.
Sure.
Your introduction. So I crave your indulgence. If you can just do that for us, please. Thank you.
Redo my introduction? Sorry, I didn't get that, Ms. Wong.
I'm apologizing because we missed a part of your introduction due to technical glitches. So I'll be very grateful if you can just redo that for us, please. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, sure. So good morning again, everyone. Many thanks to InterArts and Women Against Rape for giving me the opportunity to make this presentation. And my presentation will focus specifically on outlining recommendations for reducing stigma and discrimination against the LGBTQ plus community in Antigua and Barbuda. Now, these recommendations are informed by the findings of the research that was already outlined by Dr. Esprit, as well as feedback from different stakeholders in Antigua and Barbuda. And even though Dr. Esprit would have given a sort of taster as to what those recommendations will be, my presentation will go into more details. And just to also let you know that the recommendations that will be outlined in this presentation are also contained in a policy brief that was developed in collaboration with InterArts as well as Women Against Rape. So to start, the recommendations will focus on 4 key areas. First is changing the legal environment. Second, strengthening government policy and service provision for the LGBTQ plus community. Thirdly, increasing CSO's capacity to advocate for LGBTQ plus rights. And finally, shifting harmful attitudes and beliefs towards the LGBT plus community. So let's start with changing the law. Now, our recommendations are as follows. The government should repeal the Buggery Law and extend the law of rape to include non-consensual anal and oral sexual activity. It should also make it plain that same-sex intimacy should be excluded from the meaning of serious indecency. And these amendments should be included in the government's current amendments to the Sexual Offences Act of 1995. Secondly, the marriage, divorce, domestic violence, and adoption of children laws should be revised to ensure that the laws expressly recognize gender non-conforming identities and provide remedies and redress for non-heteronormative relationships, because currently those laws have a sort of heteronormative sort of orientation. Thirdly, In order to facilitate a more inclusive society, an anti-discrimination legislation that would prohibit discrimination on several grounds, including race, ethnicity, sex, disability, gender identity, and sexual orientation, should be made into law. The anti-discrimination legislation should cover key sectors such as employment, housing, and access to other social services. And finally, as it relates to changing the legal environment, the government should begin the process for developing a law that allows transgender individuals to change their sex and have that change recognized in all government-run identification databases. So as it relates to strengthening government policy and service provision for the LGBTQ plus community, we have several recommendations under this particular heading. The first is that the Directorate of Gender Affairs, and I'm going to be in these recommendations, if you will notice that I'll be pinpointing at certain points of specific organizations to conduct specific tasks. So in the first recommendation, the Directorate of Gender Affairs should be tasked with and given resources to create, in consultation with all relevant government departments, an inclusive template intake form for government services. And this template intake form should account for intersex, gender non-conforming identities, as well as non-heterosexual relationships. The private sector should also be encouraged to use this form if they're providing particular services. It is, however, important for the government to explain to people that it is not mandatory for them to give the information on their gender identity and sexual orientation. So even though these will be included on the intake forms, it is very important that due to the kind of existing environment, that persons do not feel as if they are being forced to give this particular information. Additionally, DOGA's GBV response and prevention should specifically include measures to address the violence LGBTQ plus people experience by virtue of their sexual orientation, gender identity, and other statuses that increase their vulnerability to violence. DOGA should also be tasked with developing and implementing a diversity and inclusion policy, which should mandate ongoing diversity and inclusive training for all government employees, parliamentarians, and judicial officers. Now, we know that currently, or I've been told that currently, the government of Antigua is looking at revising the national gender policy. And in that regard, we are recommending that that policy in its revised form should outline a framework for creating an inclusive society that would include tackling stigma and discrimination, providing greater protection and services to members of the LGBTQ plus community, and extend the mandate of gender focal points to cover LGBTQ plus issues. The Ministry of Social Transformation should also work with local CSOs to develop special protocols to guide service provision to the LGBTQ plus community, as well as provide specific services to target the LGBTQ plus individuals who need psychosocial support, especially those rejected by their families and communities. Now, these services should include a dedicated counseling hotline, housing stipend for homeless LGBTQ plus people, and specific employment support for transgender individuals. And finally, the government should outsource service provision for vulnerable LGBTQ plus people to CSOs, which have proven to be better positioned to offer meaningful services to the LGBTQ plus community. Now, this form of social contracting is already being considered by the government in the area of HIV service provision and should be extended to services for vulnerable LGBTQ plus individuals. In relation to increasing the CSO's capacity to advocate for LGBTQ plus rights, we have 4 main recommendations under this heading. So first, CSOs should focus their resources into educating members of the LGBTQ plus community on definitions and terms related to LGBTQ plus rights. Provide members of the LGBTQ plus community information sessions on the overall state of stigma and discrimination in Antigua and Barbuda, and also to provide training and other capacity building tools to support LGBTQ plus people in advocating for their own rights. So this is a form of self-empowerment, and that is something that we, in our recommendations, are asking that the CSOs use some of their resources to do as well. Additionally, CSOs should work with external partners to develop sustainable funding mechanisms in order to support the continuation of advocacy related to protecting the human rights for LGBTQ plus people in Antigua and Barbuda. Now, we know that this thing about funding is a big issue, not just with CSOs that are working with on LGBTQ plus issues, but also CSOs that are working on other issues. It's always getting funding is always an issue, and when the funding runs out, then CSOs are always finding themselves at a loss as to how they would get the money to continue the services that they have to provide. And so this is something that has to be tackled head on in order to ensure that whatever projects or programs that are being implemented, that they are sustainable. And so they don't just last for 4 or 5 months or as long as the funding is available, but that CSOs are in a position to be able to fund themselves on a continuous basis. Finally, CSOs, as it relates to looking at funding sources, CSOs should form alliances with, should build partnerships with the private sector, especially the tourism industry, to finance and provide resources to projects that increase inclusion of marginalized groups, including LGBTQ plus people. And I'm choosing tourism specifically because Antigua is very much reliant on tourism, but also the tourism industry is very much reliant on Antigua. And they also have an interest in ensuring that the image of Antigua is one that is attractive to all type of tourists who would want to come to Antigua. And so building partnerships with the private sector, especially the tourism industry, we think would be a very good way for CSOs to be able to have access to other type of funding. And finally, under this heading, this is something that is already in play, but we think that it should be something that is ongoing. And we're also recommending that CSOs should form alliances with progressive women parliamentarians to push for legislative and policy changes. CSOs have the opportunity at this moment, given that there is sort of a movement within Parliament for women, progressive women, women parliamentarians who are stepping out. So there is an opportunity for the CSOs to provide parliamentarians with briefing papers and evidence-based research that they can use to justify law and policy reform. And as we move to the final heading or the final category of recommendations, this is focused on shifting harmful attitudes and beliefs towards the LGBTQ plus community. And so this particular category focuses specifically on advocacy and what those advocacy campaigns should focus on. So first, we're recommending that in organizing and developing advocacy campaigns, these should frame, first of all, LGBTQ plus concerns as part of a broader project towards creating a more inclusive society. So rather than just framing LGBTQ plus concerns as concerns that are affecting a specific group of persons, you want to be able to move the agenda outside of that specific group of persons to make it one that is much broader and includes everybody. Because in those circumstances, non-LGBTQ plus people can feel as if they are a part of the changes that are being asked for. The second thing as it relates to advocacy is that advocacy should focus on increasing support for the protection of LGBTQ plus human rights among the elders and youth arms of faith-based organizations. And this particular approach is important because as the research, as Dr. Esprit would have indicated in her research, a large part of the reason the Antigua government has not moved towards, say, for example, taking positive steps taking positive steps to reduce stigma and discrimination is because of the influence of religion. And so if advocacy efforts are able to focus on the elders in the church as well as the youth arm organization, I do believe that will go a long way in shifting cultural and religious attitudes. The other recommendation as it relates to advocacy also focuses on religion, and advocacy efforts should therefore focus on discouraging religious groups and parents from engaging in conversion therapy practices. And a lot of persons might not consider you taking somebody to church and then getting a pastor to pray over the person to get the demon out of that individual, out of that LGBTQ plus individual. But that is something that falls under the umbrella of conversion therapy practices. And it is something that the advocacy efforts should focus on in encouraging parents, especially, and religious groups from refraining from engaging in. We're also advocating that in terms of advocacy efforts, there should be a focus on educating boys and young men to reject toxic elements of masculinity, that is the inherent homophobia and disrespect for women, and adopt healthier conceptions of masculinity. One of the reasons I believe that you find that there is more why men might have a stronger reaction against LGBTQ plus community is because, for example, within the Caribbean, masculinity is defined in a way that says, in order for you to be a man, you must reject all things that are gay. And if your masculinity is defined in that way, obviously you are going to have, in order for you to feel as if you're a man, you are going to feel the need to fight against anything that you consider to be gay or anything that you consider to be an attack on your masculinity. And so in advocacy campaigns, we have to focus on helping men and boys to be able to develop healthier forms of masculinity. We're also, in terms of the advocacy efforts, based on the research that was done, one of the recommendations is that there should be using social media to target the young, and radio to target older people, and town halls to educate the population on the definitions and terminologies related to the LGBTQ plus community, dispelling the myths of an LGBTQ plus lifestyle, which I have in quotation, and also putting forward or encouraging the need to protect and respect the human rights of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as highlighting the different ways in which the current laws produce discrimination and diminish the rights of all citizens, including the LGBTQ plus community. And finally, advocacy efforts should focus on mobilizing youths to form advocacy groups or networks to push for a more inclusive society that considers the needs of all citizens, including those with disabilities, the old, the LGBTQ plus community, women, immigrants, and other marginalized groups. And this last point focuses specifically on the youth because, as was mentioned by Dr. Esprit, the research suggests that youths, because of their exposure to social media and their exposure to people within the LGBTQ plus community, the youths are a lot more tolerant, they're a lot more respectful as it relates to the LGBTQ plus community. And so if you're able to mobilize the youths to start advocating, you will find that you have a better sort of springboard as to what the future should look like. And so finally, to conclude, reducing stigma and discrimination against LGBTQ plus individuals in Antigua and Barbuda will require legal reform, wholesale policy changes, including improvement in service provision, capacity building for CSOs and members of the LGBTQ plus community, as well as shifts in attitudes and behaviors. And that's the end of my presentation. And I want to thank you so much for